Welcome to the Vortex Nation Podcast, brought to you by lovers of hunting, shooting, public lands, the Second Amendment, and good food. Mark, two things. You stepped out real quick before we started here. One, we got a message on Instagram on the Vortex Nation Podcast page from somebody who was listening to the podcast on an iPod. And Erik and I were sitting here. We actually could not remember what those things were called. I showed Erik, and we were both like, what is it? It's an I, not a phone.
I almost called it an iTunes.
But so there was that. And then two, I got to admit, this is the second take at this podcast. So Erik and I attempted to do this podcast because it was going to be a hunt year-round for September.
Right.
And the wheels fell off, I got to say, for me. It was late in the day. I hadn't eaten lunch. And MC Ryan, I hope you buried that. It was not Erik was on point still. He was just fine.
It sounds like you set yourself up for failure though. Like
not eating and then trying to podcast. Yeah,
just
that'll do it.
Out of gas, man.
So,
well, I'm excited to be here for this one because I don't think Erik and I really talked about his hunt in too much detail when he got back, just because how things get. And I think I might have been gone when you got back, and everybody's in and out. So I'm pumped to talk about it a little bit more.
Yeah, so there's a ton to talk about, obviously, now that we're in fall with Hunt Year-Round. Yes, we've already done a September one. We're going to do another one here in a way with Erik, and actually, it's South Dakota again.
Yep.
What do you know?
We're back.
Yep. We're back at it. Why
Showing
not talk
a lot
about
of
it?
love.
Obviously, this is a slightly different hunt than the one that our friend Ryan Buckenhorn was on, and obviously, you're not live in the field right now. You're back, and we're recounting the situation. You had some funny stories, though, from this hunt, some learning lessons, and you did this hunt differently too. So this hunt was over, which day was it? Is that Labor Day?
Labor Day weekend, yep.
Labor Day weekend. So you came from Wisconsin, bombed out to
northwestern South Dakota, yep.
And did this thing in a weekend.
Yeah, we left Friday at, I want to say, well, we'll get into it, but the original plan was to leave Friday after work. But for legality reasons, in order to obtain my tag, ended up having to leave early Friday so we could get to a hardware store where my tag was sitting and waiting for me at, which we'll get into that, I'm sure, here in a little bit.
Why not get into it now?
Yeah.
Well, this is a learning lesson right off the bat for many people, I think.
Yep.
Well, I was going to say, it wasn't necessary. I remember you talking about this. It wasn't necessarily a complete lack of prior thought. It was that your prior thought just didn't quite line up.
Right. Yeah, it turned out to be a total failure on that end. But so in Wisconsin, we have, for anyone who lives in Wisconsin or whoever's hunted Wisconsin, we have digital licenses. So you can actually save, the DNR sends you a PDF of your license that you can save to your phone, which is super handy. Because then when you're in the field, everyone always has their phone on them. You can have that digital copy right there, and you're always legal. So,
can you put it on an iPod?
You can put it on an iPod. You can't put it on an iTunes. But anyways, I bought my South Dakota license on the Thursday prior to the opener. So I think that would have been like August 29th. We drove out there on Friday, August 30th. But bought it Thursday night, and I remember screen shooting and saving some like documentation that says confirmed, you have your license, but nothing looked very, official in that it didn't give me like a confirmation number. It didn't look like an actual license. It just said, you have your license, yada, yada. So then, actually that was Wednesday. First thing Thursday morning, I called South Dakota Game and Fish and talked to a super helpful guy named Joe. And apparently he's like one of two people that works out of this office that he was in. And
a lot of people know Joe.
Yeah. Ryan somehow knew him too, even. I guess he had dealt with them. So
well, Ryan lives in South Dakota, sort of.
Yeah. So anyways, Joe explained to me, he said that you actually need the physical license and that after you buy it online, they send it out to you, which takes 7 to 10 business days, which was going to be no good because I would actually be back in Wisconsin by the time the license would finally arrive. So what he did is he helped me find a license, a place where they print off licenses, like the hard copies. which ended up just being an Ace Hardware store in a little town in western South Dakota. And he had it rerouted there, so we actually ended up leaving then early Friday morning so we could be at that Ace Hardware before they closed, get the license, which was a duplicate. So we've, ended up, I forget if we voided the one license or however it worked out, but ended up me and my hunting partner were both able to get the actual licenses at the hardware store rather than having to wait the 7 to 10 business days. So right out of the gates, that helped us a bunch, because if Joe wouldn't have been able to give us some direction on that, the hunt never would have happened because we wouldn't have had our licenses in time. So number one takeaway on that is to do your research well in advance on how the tag system works in the state that you're going to be hunting in. And for me, this was the first time I was hunting out of state, hunting in South Dakota, I should say. So I was entirely unfamiliar with their license system. And, I guess it was just a miscommunication on my end, and I thought you could have a digital copy when, in fact, that's definitely not the truth.
So keep that in mind, and if you do forget, then just call Joe.
Yeah, he knew the people I should talk to. He knew the people at the Ace Hardware who could print this off for me. And it was funny because when we finally arrived there, I had called the Ace Hardware just to confirm, like, hey, I'm that guy that's really screwing everything up for you right now. So when I got there, we came in the door, and there was this really helpful older gentleman, kind of greeting people. And said, hey, how can I help you today? I said, oh, well, we're here to pick up a license. He's like, didn't even acknowledge us. He just turned around. He's like, they're here. The guys from Wisconsin are here. So then this nicer lady came up and helped us out, got our licenses, and we were on our way.
Bam.
So
I imagine another option would have been just to stop by the Ace Hardware during business hours.
That would have been another option. Yep. Which is what I should have done. I don't know why I was so dead set on buying it online.
You were anxious, antsy.
I jumped the gun.
I've been thinking this. I need to get. You just want to make sure you have it. Like
Yep.
at least you feel more like you have it in hand. You
Yep.
know?
Oh yeah.
I don't know. I mean, case in point though, to pre-planning, when I went to Alaska this fall for moose, I was like, you had the option to buy it beforehand, and then they mail everything to you.
Yep.
And I was like, you know what, we need to stop by the Sportsman's Warehouse up there anyway, and I was like, I'm just gonna simplify my life and just get it when I get up there. It's over the counter tag, and they were out of locking tags. And then the next place that we went to, they were out of locking tags as well.
Well, yeah, that's kind of what I was just thinking, because if you buy it ahead of time, then you at least know, okay, when I get there, I'm gonna have something to do.
Right.
It's kind of scary when you. I don't know. I'd be likening it to like going on a trip and not having a hotel booked yet.
Yeah, I mean, it never occurred to me that they wouldn't have like what you needed. Since it was just an over the counter. I don't know. Like to me, it's like,
Yeah.
well, I need to go get fuel for my stove. I need to go get
right.
a few extra whatever that last minute things that you can't
Yep.
travel with or whatever. And so we ended up getting it at the Fish and Game office. They
Yeah.
had them, but little lesson learned there. You know,
Yeah.
don't always count on
Absolutely.
folks having what you need.
Yep.
So this was I'm trying to think. Now, this was like your first time going out on
Mule deer hunt.
Mule deer hunt,
Yep.
right? And you were going, like, because I don't want to make this seem like you haven't hunted before, because you are definitely an avid hunter from around the area.
Yeah.
But you're doing this hunt differently than I think that you've done most hunts before, right?
Definitely.
So, yeah.
I guess growing up in the Midwest, almost all of my hunting background is whitetail hunting or turkey hunting, your standard Midwestern critters, I guess.
In fact, Erik, I'll cut you off right there. Erik is so adept at this that he cut his whitetail season in Wisconsin extremely short this year.
Yep.
By hammering home on a really nice buck.
Yep.
He's
Better
so
be
good, it's
lucky than
boring.
good.
The day after opening day.
Yep. So, that I guess kind of is all of my hunting background, which is different than these Western hunts because there's just so many variables that comes into play. And granted, our hunt wasn't a true backpacking, living out of a backpack in a tent for a week. I mean, we did live out of a tent, but it wasn't the kind of hunt where you pack your tent in on your back and then set up for one night and then pick it up, set up another night. We had a destination campground, but it was different for me in that it was my first time ever going to an area that I had seen only on maps. And get there, you have 3 days to try and figure this out, and then you got to head back home for work and other things. So it was a really short, tight window, but it was also a lot of fun because I feel like that's how you kind of, if you're always waiting for it to be the perfect fit to like go on a trip like this.
Yep.
I've been kicking around doing a mule deer hunt for the past 3 years. And midsummer this year, I was talking myself back into the same conclusion that I have done for years and years, where it's like, it's not going to work out. It's not ideal. But doing a hunt on a weekend like this, even though it's about a 10 to 12 hour drive from where we're at here in southwestern Wisconsin, it still gets you out there. It gets you hunting, and it gets you that experience, which I think is pretty valuable stuff.
Well, I think that's something that we've talked about a fair amount here too. I guess almost by necessity, geographically, we're kind of forced to do that a little bit. But I think a lot of folks think there's definitely, a romantic quality about the West, the wide open, landscapes and mule deer and elk. And is it ideal to do it in a weekend? Probably not. But I think a lot of folks say, I want to do it someday, and it's going to be this thing I do one time. And you did it in a weekend.
Yeah, exactly.
So I think that's something, cool to keep in mind as far as timeline. If you want to make it happen, you can make it happen. And, I think you learned a lot about that area just in a handful of days. And, hopefully you'll be able to go back. Heck, it's a long season. You could go back this year.
Yeah, exactly. For sure.
Pre-scouting it then before you headed out there, you hadn't done, we've talked before about Ryan practically living in South Dakota, as a second home sometimes. He goes out there just to scout.
Yep.
At times he'll go on vacation just to scout the areas that he's hunting in. Now, you didn't do that. Nope. You did more of the Onyx kind of style of scouting.
Exactly.
What kind of stuff are you looking for primarily in that type of... Also, while you're at it, too, why don't you explain for some of the listeners what the terrain where you were at looked like, too? So explaining the terrain and then kind of what you start to look for in that terrain before you head out.
So that's a really good point, especially, given that here where we're at in Wisconsin in general has a lot of trees. South Dakota, I want to say, has like the second or third lowest tree density in the country. And the property that we were hunting had next to, it was a 30 to 50,000 acre property. And, when you looked at that on an aerial map with satellite imagery, it hardly had any tree cover. It was just a lot of cuts and ravines. It was that Badlands type habitat. I don't know if that rock is called bentonite or if that's the mineral, but anyways, for just to kind of describe it, it's you would have these tabletop ridges, and then all of a sudden a real aggressive 90-degree like a cliff face, and that might be 50 feet, or it might be as low as just like 5 to 8 feet. And what that did is, as the sun would come up, rise in the east in the morning, and, cycle over to the west, that would create really aggressive shadow areas. Once you would get in those, I would say maybe 9 a.m. to 11:30, and then from 2:30 into the evening hours, you would have that sun at an angle where it would cast more of a shadow off those cuts. So those deer were bedding in those areas. So to back up, what I did for my scouting is I obviously looked at Onyx quite a bit to kind of understand the terrain. I looked at my topo maps. And then, I still use Google Earth quite a bit. Even though Onyx is awesome, Google Earth has this really neat feature where you can actually look at how the sun is going to be landing or casting its shadow on the terrain. So what you can do is it's a little slider bar. You click it, drops down the slider, and you can go back and forth throughout the day, and that'll show where the sun is positioned and how it's casting shadows in the terrain. So by doing that, I was able to kind of drop some pins, thinking hey, this is a really good cut here. It looks like there might be some water. Drop a pin, and then that would be an area that I would key on. So
you left that part out on the first.
I was going to say that's actually pretty interesting. I wasn't aware of that.
Second time's a charm.
It is.
You could almost plan some of your buck bedding strategy. Beforehand.
Carry on. Sorry, I interrupted.
No. It
very interesting.
That was the first time I, figured that out on Google Earth. It was kind of like a, mind-blown moment, because it really does help out. Even in areas like the Midwest, you can figure out where the sun is shining on different points. And you can go down a long rabbit hole there. But anyways, I would kind of, look at these areas and get rough general areas that I wanted to focus on. And now none of this stuff was, okay, this is the spot on the spot. You're kind of doing a rough overlay on an area and saying, hey, here's a spot that's maybe 500 acres that I want to look at. So you're not honing into this is where I want to be. You're looking at the areas And then you're kind of waiting to do that ground truthing once you get out there, get that boots on the ground, and just be as mobile as you can to kind of say, yes, this is something that, warrants more time, or no, scrap it, move on to the next one. So, that's how all the front end work looked like. It was a lot of just, looking at maps, trying to figure out what the terrain looked like without seeing it, and Google Earth also has that thing where you can do the, drop your pin down and you can actually see it from the ground perspective. Mm-hmm. So I did a little bit of that too. But yeah, I mean, for anyone who's ever been out in that Badlands type country, it's definitely fairly rugged in that it's just so choppy. Those tabletop ridges are flat as can be, but then all of a sudden it just drops down, and those were the areas where we were finding those deer.
They even have the ground perspective, like just in the middle of nowhere?
No, you have to be off like a main road.
You have to be on a road.
So I found the closest main road, and I'm like,
because I don't think the Google dudes in those Priuses are exactly off-roading the Badlands to get that. I mean, that'd be really going above and beyond. That would be interesting.
Like a profiling, Jim.
Okay. Anyway, so how do you feel like when you put boots to the ground? How do you feel that paid off?
So
what changed when you actually got there?
That's exactly what I was going to ask.
Yeah.
It's like, how did your pre-hunt scouting compare to what it was like when you actually got there? And yeah, did you find like, oh, yep, totally nailed it, or were there some surprises in there too?
There were definitely surprises, and I guess to start out. Day one, well, we got there, when we got there on Friday, which is the day before the opener, we were getting there right around sundown. So you could still see roughly what the terrain looked like, but it wasn't like we had time to get out and walk or anything like that. We pretty much got there as the sun was setting, set up camp, hit the bed, and, we're ready bright and early the next morning. But anyways, that first morning was a lot of, we looked at the areas that we kind of had identified and spent time there in the places that looked the best on the map. The problem with that is if me being, relatively a layman in terms of mule deer hunting looks at a spot and says, hey, this looks really good, that's where a lot of people, I think, are kind of going to be drawn to. If it looks really good, people are naturally going to be drawn to it. So that first morning, we did have a few hunters that ended up kind of cutting us off, and they were there before us, so we just kind of sat back and watched what they were doing. They put some stalks on some deer and whatnot. And there were deer in those areas, but, the pressure was just a little bid higher than what we expected, I guess.
What's the general, maybe unspoken rule as to, when you see other guys out there? How do you know that they're out there before you guys? And then, is it all unspoken, or is it kind of do you start making hand signals at one another, or middle fingers start flying? I'm
possibly all of the above at times.
Yeah. That's what I was gonna say. It's a hybrid.
Yeah.
So we were the only people that I was aware of that was camping in this area of the property, because when we got there on Friday night, we drove all the way through it for the most part and didn't see a single person set up, and then we came back and ended up setting up our tent fairly close to the southwest entrance of this public parcel. And then that morning, we're getting ready. We had first pick because we were out there before anyone, and we ended up hearing vehicles coming in. So, instead of parking in the lot that we were originally going to be in, we kind of drove around and got in this other, and these are all just little minimum maintenance roads. So parking lot is a very loose term. It's just don't drive over the sagebrush is pretty much the big thing out there from what I understand. So, we just kind of pulled over on this little dirt road, and then when the sun came up, these guys had actually come in the back way, and it was smart in hindsight what they were doing, because they were coming in from the east, and with that sun rising in the east, it was hard for even us to spot them knowing that they were there, let alone for unsuspecting deer. Because they had that sun at their back, they were so hard to pick up. It's almost that effect where if you're looking up into a light and you're trying to pick out a fine detail, you're not going to see it because that light is almost overpowering you. Same kind of thing.
Oh, that's why I can't ever spot sunspots. They're always talking about those different sunspots on the surface of the sun where, crazy stuff happens.
Oh, okay,
I always try seeing those when they talk about them, but it's hard to make them out when you stare at the sun.
This is true. I don't think you're supposed to stare at the sun.
Anyway.
So, what we ended up doing is we kind of watched these guys, and we were both looking at the same group of deer. There were a group of a few does and a couple fawns down there, and then there were 2 smaller bucks. And we were out there for 3 days. We were literally going in the mindset that we were going to shoot any buck. We weren't going to be picky and wait for the biggest antlered deer out there. We knew what we were dealing with, and we wanted to get, leave with some venison, hopefully. But these guys were in a much better position. They had the wind better. So we just kind of sat back from afar and watched them kind of go in.
So that's more just like you guys didn't have the greatest opportunity necessarily. They had a better opportunity, so don't screw it up for both of you.
And now that's a good question, actually, because if the roles were reversed, I would have kind of expected them to do the same. But that's
right.
That's
not
all
necessarily
a judgment
guaranteed.
Call. Right, exactly.
There's no middle urinal rule, and that's just
no.
Well, I guess
that seems like it should be a hard and fast rule, but a lot of people don't know that rule.
Yeah.
I'm talking about the middle stalling, actually.
Right. Yeah. Anyway, back to hunting.
But yeah, no, back to hunting. I mean, there maybe isn't a hard and fast rule. I think there's some common courtesies that are, I think most of the time extended. I think it varies by scenario, but in a situation like that, they kind of got there first. They were, putting the move on those deer. I think most people would give, hey, you got first crack. Now, that's not to say, though, like I've been in some situations like that. You're like, okay, those guys are working those deer, but if that blows up on them, where are those deer maybe going to go?
Right.
Right, yeah, I was
you
going
can
to say,
as long as you don't screw their hunt up, you might get one as it squirts out the back door.
Yep, exactly. Well, and kind of in an indirect way, they ended up helping us because we considered that for a little bit, and then we're like, well, we're just going to get to a really, really high spot, the highest spot that we could find on the property, and we were just going to sit there and glass into the mid-morning hours. So we're walking up this big ridge and got up there, and within 5 minutes of sitting down, we didn't even have, tripods or anything set up. We were just glassing, hand-holding binoculars, and put up the binos, and right away, instantly saw a deer bedded on the edge of this cut. And it was right in the shady spot, like it was an ideal spot for a deer to be. And, I remember Ryan and I talking about this prior to heading out there. He's like, you'll get your deer eyes quick once you spot your first one. Mm-hmm. So this was the first one that I spotted in its bed. The deer we saw that morning were up and active. They were feeding still because it was the early morning hours and stuff. But this deer was bedded, and you could tell he was going to be there for a decent amount of time, just given the way that the shadows were. He was kind of getting away from the sun. It was a perfect spot for him. So I ended up getting a little bit better look at him. It was a 1x2, a spork muley.
Nice.
And, I was going to be more than happy to, wrap my tag on that deer. So long story short, went around the ridge that we were on, got on the backside of it, got down into the canyon that he was bedded in. And it was a perfect setup because the wind was going over his back, which would have been terrible if you tried to come in over the top of him. But I was able to snake around and actually come in head on with that wind blowing, over the top from him. It was blowing my scent the dead opposite way that he was bedded. The only issue was he was looking down the canyon that way.
Okay, right.
So I just kind of had to keep, terrain features in between him and I. And I kind of had him, I marked a pin on my Onyx when I started getting down there into the canyon that identified this really unique kind of, basically there was a big cut, and then there was this one lone standing rock, like a really noticeable, predominant tall rock that he was kind of bedded next to. And I had that marked, and I looked at it on my map right before I actually popped around, and I figured that he had to be really, really close. So when I came around...
So you actually used, pardon me for interrupting, you actually used Onyx then as part of your stock.
Yeah.
So then in being able to understand what's actually closer to, dude, Onyx, hey, these new maps things are crazy.
Oh, it's a game changer.
But yeah, I mean, you look at that. I mean, everything changes the second you step off that canyon rim or, off the hillside and you get down in. I mean, really, literally 10 feet, it looks different.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's just, another really cool way to use that tool.
I interrupted at the cliffhanger.
No, and that's a good point because so where I had my pin marked where the deer was turned out to be pretty much right where he was. So anyways, I am starting to come around the last piece of cover that I had that separated me from the deer. And I knew I would be within bow range when I came around there. I didn't know if that was going to be 20 yards or if that was going to be 50 yards. I figured it would be somewhere in that window. So I came around, and he ended up being a heck of a lot closer than I expected. I figured he'd be closer to that 40, 50-yard mark. I came around, and he was like 18 yards.
Oh, no way.
Bedded looking right at me. And for a second, it took me so much by surprise that I didn't just draw, anchor and let the arrow go. Had I done that, this story could have a totally different ending with a lot tastier, table fare to come home, but that ended up not happening. I kind of looked at him, it caught me by surprise, and I hesitated just for that split second, which he then jumped up out of his bed and hopped up on top of the cut that he was bedded beneath, and then he turned around. So I quick ranged him, and he was at 42 yards. He was perfectly broadside, and I had still have at this point, a single pin slider sight on my bow. It was set for 30 yards, and he was 42. I figured hindsight, I don't think I would do that hunt again with that kind of equipment. I think if I were going to do it, I would have a multi-pin sight that, I would just be able to draw anchor, shoot with my 40-yard pin. But I dialed to 42 yards, and, all that takes time, but it probably took in the grand scheme maybe, 2-3 seconds to range, dial, and then draw. So I got back to full draw, and I ended up shooting shot just over his back. It was one of those deals where so much stuff was happening right now where I think I ended up rushing it, and I literally shot just over his back. It was within inches. But anyways, that ended up being a pretty cool takeaway because at the end of that, that's our first morning out there. We had a shot, and we were able to, have a successful stalk. So those were two big takeaways in itself that we were hoping were going to propel us, the rest of the hunt. And to an extent, they did. I think we got better as the hunt went on at making moves on deer and sneaking and stalking and stuff like that. But the only thing that I guess, kind of hurt us to an extent is we had good success that first morning. We were like, hey, we got a shot. This is what we want to focus on. That we ended up we had this whole huge property, and now all of a sudden we're kind of putting the microscope on this one little section of terrain. And, we hunted that afternoon, didn't really see a whole lot. And then the next morning and didn't see a whole lot.
That's tough though, man, because you're on a super limited timeline, right? So when you're not hunting, you're not hunting. I mean, you're definitely learning more if you're scouting or driving around or trying to find a new area, but it's tough to leave, some deer.
To find deer.
Maybe, or I don't know. It's tricky. I mean,
it's tough to make long-term decisions when you don't have a long time.
Right.
Yep.
Yeah.
You kind of have to live with what's there in the moment.
Yep, exactly. And,
live in the moment, Jim.
Just go with the flow. I'm wearing the perfect T-shirt for that today.
You are.
Oh, yeah. Heck yeah.
Got
my California T-shirt.
Got that kind of hippie look going on.
Yeah, I like it. This is not... Well, yeah, anyway. I don't know why I'm wearing it. When you go there, I guess we went there on our honeymoon, so, it is what it is.
Hey, good memories.
Now I'm embarrassed. I feel like a bunch of people are going to listen here that I'm wearing a California shirt, and they'll just stop listening.
It's still a state in the union as far as I know.
Yeah, still a little bit. We still have a lot of customers in California.
Dude, tons.
It's getting really off topic.
Yeah. Some good mule deer hunting in California,
good
from my
mule deer,
understanding.
blacktail.
Yeah.
So many good things.
All sorts of fun
Yes.
things.
Yeah. Build it up again, Gotta
Make California great again.
Yeah. But anyways, so to that point, we ended up spending the afternoon of the first day in relatively, not in that same exact area because that deer ran for about as far as it. That's the problem with a state like South Dakota where you can see so far. When you spook a deer, it is the most helpless feeling watching that thing just, holy crap, I didn't think it had the stamina to okay, there it's gone. It's just you literally watch it run until you can't see it.
You watch it run
anymore.
away for a long time.
Yep. In Wisconsin, if you miss a deer, whatever, that deer runs off into the woods, and you at least have this false hope that maybe it just stopped.
Right. Out of sight, out of mind.
Yeah. South Dakota,
I'm sure he's just around the corner.
Yeah. Last update I got, that deer is still running.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
So anyways, no, go ahead.
Oh, I think I interrupted because where are we at now?
Afternoon of the first day.
Right. Okay. Continue. Sorry.
So afternoon of the first day, we focused on an area that was very similar, relatively close in proximity to, where I missed that deer that morning, and had a really unproductive sit. We walked, or not sit, just we had an unproductive evening of hunting. We walked in, We saw a lot of deer sign, but we weren't able to, find anything bedded down. We thought we had all the right conditions. We had the wind in our face. It was really hot that evening, and there was some water in this area that we were, walking in on.
What kind of water was it?
It was just, they got rained the week leading up to when we came out. So I don't think these were areas that held water long term.
Okay.
The rain that they got that week leading up to the opener, I want to say was fairly, substantial, that it filled up some of these like low-lying areas. Basically, it was like little puddles in between big rocks.
Okay.
And you could see that there was a lot of like, fresh, hot sign kind of right around those areas. And we figured if we found that, we were going to be in the chips. But it was also, this area had a little bit more contour to the rocks and stuff, where like that area we were in that morning was primarily just a long north-south running canyon. So you could get on the west side and you could glass all those cuts. The stuff we went that afternoon was the same kind of habitat in that it was a canyon and a lot of, cuts right there, but it was spitting off in every different direction. So there was no really good line of attack to get up here and, glass this section of it because there was just so much. So that afternoon we saw 2 does and just kind of felt like we ended up almost wasting an evening going out there and kind of throwing darts at the board and seeing what was going to stick. It didn't stick.
You're seeing whitetail out there too, right?
We did, actually. We saw.
And your tag could have gotten a whitetail. Am I correct? Right,
Yep.
but you were going for mule deer.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. Actually, we saw this is, kind of getting a little off topic, but I saw one of the biggest whitetail bucks I've ever seen.
No way.
Period. We were, that morning after I missed that deer, we just kind of went on a little drive. And I think they were wheat fields or milo fields or something. Western crops, we have corn and soybeans in Wisconsin. But there were farmers harvesting whatever it was. It was wheat or milo, one of the two. And they were combining this one field, and there was another field that backed right up to it. There was this little island of like, kind of a waterway.
Okay.
And it was maybe about 100 yards off the road, and we stopped, and we were just kind of watching the farmers combine. And I got my binos up to like glass into that little island of trees. I'm like, man, that looks holy crap, there's a huge buck. And like as soon as I got my binos up, there was this giant buck that stood up right out of that waterway. And he also ran.
Son of a gun.
Forever.
Oh, no way. So you saw him get up then.
Yeah.
I was going to say, man, I'd been knocking on that the window of his combine. Like,
man.
hey, excuse me, sir. Do you mind if I...
Yeah.
Yeah.
But so there were whitetails out there too.
Right on. Now, I remember because I've heard this before too, and I know Mark hasn't yet, but I think it was maybe the next day or something like that, you found like the Shangri deer of all Shangri deers.
It was the creme de la creme.
Creme de la creme. How did that work out
Really?
again? Yeah.
Yep. So it was really interesting. We ended up, you look at this area on a map and you think that, man, it almost didn't look big enough for us. We figured we were going to be super mobile and we were going to be running out of spots. And granted, this is the first time I've ever hunted an area that just has no tree cover, so that was different. I was eliminating way more habitat by looking at the map than I should have been. And so we were focusing on this stuff that had the most diversity in it, and as far as like diversity of terrain.
Right.
So we went back to that same general area where I missed the deer the morning before, and saw a couple antelope, saw I think a mule deer doe and her fawn, and just we're like, okay, this is our last full day of hunting, so we were gonna spend dark to dark just kind of getting after it. So at about 8 o'clock, 2.5 hours of glassing, we hadn't really seen anything that we were dead set on. We just, started hiking. And we had came across this area. We were going to get to this other canyon that had a lot of different cuts and diversity, elevation and stuff going on. And in between these two canyons, and they're probably about 3-4 miles apart from one another, there's this kind of like, more gradual, like almost like sandhills, western Nebraska type looking stuff. Like most of the Badlands habitat that we were hunting is really aggressive. Like, it's just a 90-degree
really
cliff.
cut.
Yeah. And then this stuff was much more gradual, like rolling. Mm-hmm. And it had a lot of natural, like grasses in it. I don't know what kind it was, but it was, about knee to chest high grass. And then in the bottom of it, it actually had a like creek, or not a river, but like a little creek that was holding a really good amount of water, and it had a lot of vegetation around it. and then right next to that creek was the only like actual substantial cut, albeit it was maybe only a 10-foot little like dip, but it was enough to cast a shadow right next to all that stuff. So when we found that, right away we were actually passing through it, and as we were passing through, we saw a muley doe in that area. And at this point it's midday Sunday, and we're like, hey, we're gonna go after it. So my buddy made a stalk on her and came up, unsuccessful. Came back, and him and I are looking at it on a map and kind of coming up with a game plan. And we're like, we just got to follow this creek and see what we can find. So we did that, and we just stopped and started kind of glassing in there before we started moving in. And in like 5 minutes of glassing, we ended up glassing up 2 bucks. One was a fork. One was I think it was a spike or another spork, small buck. And then like 5 or 6 other does. And they were all in this area where the creek kind of came to a bend. There was some really tall, like chest-high grass, and all you could see was like the heads of these deer as they were, feeding and moving in that stuff. So it was perfect habitat. Had we found that on day one and could have focused on that throughout the whole trip, I feel like it may have been a different story. I think we at least would have had a few more opportunities than we had, given that the way things did shake out. So
yeah. That is the tough thing with doing the weekend style thing. It's inevitably, of course, you find the really, really solid spot.
Oh, yeah.
Right before you got to go. And what happened again? You were about to go in, you were about to make a move on a deer, and then all of a sudden a coyote came in and bumped them out.
It was a crazy deal. We watched that. We were going to shoot either that spike or that forky. We were going to shoot either one of them. And we ended up kind of making a move on them once they did bed down. And they bedded down in the grass, which was like completely sun exposed. And it was warm that day. It was in the 90s. So we didn't think they were going to, spend a whole lot of time baking in the sun. There was a much more predominant, that little 10-foot, cut that I mentioned earlier was maybe about 60, 70 yards in between them and where we were. So we ended up, once they bedded for the first time, we ended up kind of putting the afterburners on and got up there as quick as we could to that cut, because we figured what they were going to do is come into that cut and bed down in the shade. Because as we were actually walking in there to get closer to those deer, we saw a bunch of different beds, and we were thinking that we were, in the exact spot that those deer wanted to be. So sure enough, they actually did stand up out of their bed, and we got to about 50 yards from them when they were bedded in the tall grass. And they started feeding our way again, and got to about 30, 40 yards. I mean, they were well within bow range, but the grass was just too tall where, it wasn't going to work out. So long story short, they eventually did kind of commit and started feeding right at us, right where we were. And we were kind of setting up the cut kind of bended at like a 90-degree angle, from south, and then went east. It was a north-south running cut, and then all of a sudden it just bended east. And we were right on the south side of that bend, and we thought those deer were going to come right around. We were going to have a top pin shot at them. And that may have happened, but they were just getting ready to kind of commit and come around that corner. And this coyote came up over the next hill, and we looked at the coyote, we looked at the deer were looking at the coyote, and it wasn't one of those situations where the coyote was hunting, or predating on these deer or anything like that.
Yeah, just being a jerk.
Yeah, they just literally bumped into one another. Coyote looked at the deer and kind of, oh, hey, what's up? Deer looked at the coyote, and they kind of boogered, got up, and they ran about 50 yards, and they didn't like the situation, so we tried putting another move on them. That coyote came down into the valley, and then they ended up blowing out of there. But, yeah, there were deer loaded in that area.
Dang.
Crazy. Close, man.
Yeah.
Close,
Coyote.
though.
Yep.
But, dude, you're 10,000 steps ahead the next time you go.
Absolutely.
And like we keep talking, you did it in a weekend, or a long weekend, 3-day weekend.
Yep.
Mm-hmm. Let me ask you this, too. I think I asked this to Mark, and I don't know if I asked it to maybe everybody who's on this one. What your personality type? Are you the personality type to be like, okay, cool, did that hunt. I feel like now going to do something else that I have no experience in? Or are you the kind of guy where it's like, okay, I put in all that work and that time.
Mm-hmm.
I might as well have it pan out, and I'm going to go back.
I feel like, given that, I still have a tag this year, the tag goes, I think, until January 1st or something like that. If I were going to go back this year, I would go back to that same area, because it would be kind of like I put a few of the puzzles together, and then to go back there and have something pay off or not, whatever, it would just be putting more of those pieces together. Now next year, if I were going to do this again, which I definitely want to, I just don't know that I would focus on the same area.
Yeah.
And I think if I were going to do anything differently, it would be like you kind of mentioned Ryan's approach. Like he'll go out and he'll scout for a weekend. That's what I would do. Is I would make ideally that you would have 2 scouting trips kind of going into it, because I just feel like if we would have had more time scouting, we would have known to focus on that kind of oasis that we just kind of talked about from day one. Rather than kind of find that late in the game on the last day and, try and throw a Hail Mary at it and hope something sticks.
Yeah. Or you might find 3 of those spots.
Exactly.
Then if you burn one or, just spend a little too much time in there, and heck, maybe you get one down in there, and you disrupt the area, but then you have, a couple, plan A, B, and C, and some backup spots. So
definitely.
The more spots, the better.
Absolutely. That's the one common theme that I hear in guys that do stuff like this. It's, that they want to spend more time scouting than they do hunting. And that totally held true in this, kind of talked my way right into that.
Now, if you went back later on this year, it would be a lot different, though, don't you? I mean, maybe because the deer are just going to be in a different stage of their deerness. Whatever deer do, whatever goes on.
Yep. They'll be, they would definitely be in a different, phase of their.
We've got Cooper here in the studio, and Cooper is the large golden retriever lab mix, and he's trying to play with MC Ryan's settings.
I was trying to get a picture.
I got a pic. Don't
harassing Ryan.
Don't worry, I got that.
Look for this on the Vortex Nation Podcast Instagram page.
He's doing it for the gram. But yeah, so they'd be in a very different stage of their deerness. Different switches have turned off and on.
Yep.
So yeah.
Yeah, they would. From talking to Ryan, it sounds like mule deer start rutting around like middle of November. Where it seems like whitetails. Yeah, it seems like whitetails, and I could be totally wrong. So if someone listening has other ideas or thoughts on this, definitely let us know. But from my experience with whitetails, is you want to be in the woods that like November 1st through November 10th. Where it sounds like if you're mule deer hunting, you might want to be November 10th through like November 20th area. So
no, the situation too with other hunters on that public land would probably be dramatically different. Don't you think?
Definitely.
Because the time that you went, is that a common time for people to go in that area, or is it more common for them to go like November 10th through 20th or so?
I'd be really curious to know the actual answer to that, but I do know that this year was the first time that South Dakota had their September 1st opener.
Right.
So I almost wonder if that influenced a little bit more hunting pressure than they traditionally would have had.
Just
early
out of
in
excitement
the
of something new.
When was it starting previously? Was it 2
like
weeks
22nd.
Earlier?
It was the third Saturday, I believe, of September. So it usually fell in that like 22nd-ish.
Yeah, which can be like, that's a pretty big difference in a deer's deerness and what they're doing and their summer patterns and hashtag deerness. But probably by that time they've stripped their velvet, later in the year, at the previous opener. So, I mean, you're looking at probably a time frame where you can spot a deer. You're probably a little bit limited as far as movement. I bet those, early morning hours are pretty key and the evening hours are pretty key when those deer are up and moving a little bit easier to spot.
Yep.
But then again, if you get a deer bedded, he's probably going to stay put for a little while, depending on the sun.
Yeah, exactly. That was the biggest takeaway for us is, once we were able to find deer bedded, you could almost kind of tell, like to your point, if they were going to stay in that bed. Just reading the deer's body language on that one that I missed versus those 2 bucks that were bedded in the middle of that grass was totally different than the ones that were in the grass.
Interesting.
They seemed like they were, hey, we're kind of hanging out here for a little bit, but we're going to be getting up, and they were more active. They were checking the wind more. Their ears were moving around all over. Their heads were looking at stuff. Whereas that buck that was bedded in the cut was literally asleep at one point. So just totally different body language on those 2 deer. And that was probably the biggest takeaway, for understanding kind of those early season mule deer, I guess. So,
yeah.
Well, maybe you'll just have to go back in November since you don't have a Wisconsin buck tag anymore. So.
Yep. I would not be opposed.
Exactly. I know I had one more question too for you, which was, you were only there for a weekend, but I think it sounded like when you got back, you still thought you packed heavy.
Oh, definitely. Way too much. It was insane.
You were even on the podcast with the guys in Backcountry Hunting, and they said don't pack too heavy.
And
but actually part of it, though, is they did, we talked about that going out there and actually doing a hunt, you quickly learn what can get nixed in the pack.
Definitely.
So what did you have that you're like, didn't need it too heavy?
The first thing that we overestimated on was propane for the camp stove. We brought...
Did you bring one of the giant ones from the gas station for your grill?
Yeah, essentially. We brought 2 or 3. I want to say we brought 3 of the, not the small softball size ones. We brought 3 of the football size propane tanks. So I mean, if the temperature would have plummeted, we could have just lived off propane and heated ourselves that way. So, and then we also, I'm trying to think.
Your spotter was too big.
Spotter was too big. That was the other thing. Yep.
You were rocking a 65 mil, and you said he could have gotten away with the baby racer or something?
Yeah. So we brought the 11 to 33 Razor spotter. And that was what we ended up, using the entire trip. That thing fit in my water bottle holder on my pack super conveniently. And for what we were doing, glassing stuff that was probably in that, I would say 500 to 1,000 yard range.
Oh yeah, perfect.
Yeah, it was ideal because you still had that wider field of view where you could kind of scan these cuts. Whereas with that, because how I found out the 85 millimeter spotter that I brought was too big was when I was trying to glass that buck that I ended up missing. I knew right where he was. And I was as wide as I could get on that thing, and I could not find that deer for the life of me. Finally, I'm like, screw it, I don't need to get this good a look at him, and I went down and made my stalk.
Yeah, you don't need to see individual ticks on his.
No, that's a big thing to point out, though. I mean, that field of view as far as acquiring that subject, man, it's a really big deal, I mean, because so often you find a buck, right, or whatever you're trying to get a closer look at, and you're like, okay, he's below the big rock, or there's the big green tree on the left. I know when I find the big green tree, I can go down and to the right or whatever, wherever that is.
Yep.
And when you don't have a wide enough field of view, it's difficult to find those landmarks or the animal itself, so.
Absolutely. Yeah, and they're just so much more packable. It was, everyone's always talking about how much weight in their pack and all that stuff. I mean, for that hunt, it's tough to beat those compact spotters.
Yeah, it's the right tool for the job.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, sometimes the big 85 that's the one you need. You wouldn't even think about going the other way, right?
Right, exactly.
But that little 11 to 33 is kind of the unsung hero of the spotter world. I mean, optically, it kills it. It's lightweight, super packable, gets the job done. I still love the 65.
Yeah.
The 33 is pretty sweet.
Yep.
It is. I like that little thing. I'm trying to think. I can't think of anything else. I know I named a couple for you. But
yeah. Oh, I mean,
big
there was
propane, football-sized propane tanks.
Yeah.
Big spotters.
We had way too much toilet paper,
Really?
Yeet Mountain House for a while. I mean, we didn't have a whole lot going on where we needed to use toilet paper.
After a while, you don't need it.
Yep.
Yeah, that's essentially like sticking a cork in your system.
Yeah. I mean, full disclosure, we brought, I think, 8 rolls of toilet paper. I don't know what I was expecting was going to happen to myself out there, but we did.
We had used that much in my house in like a couple of weeks.
We would have been ready for it, and then oh man, there was other things too. I'm trying to think. We brought way too much bottled water, but that was just I think we were kind of going to err on the side of caution for that. One of the things, though, that was also kind of interesting is I didn't have access to a really high-end cooler or anything. I literally borrowed my neighbor down the road. He had a 75-quart igloo from his parents thought 1972 or something like that. And I mean, the thing was light enough. It's a 75-quart cooler, and you can pick that thing up with one hand and throw it in the truck. It's there's nothing to it. But what I did is I brought beforehand, I froze 4 1-gallon jugs of water, just milk jugs, and threw those in there. And then I had a bag of ice with, just that you would find at any gas station, a large bag of ice, and kept that cooler in the shade before we went and all that stuff. Anyways, having those 4-gallon jugs of water kept that ice in that gas station ice bag cold enough where it didn't entirely melt. in 2.5 days of 90-degree daytime temperature.
It's a smart idea. That is the giant milk jugs full of, because there's less surface area in that ice when it's in a giant milk jug shaped ice cube.
Well, it doesn't
less surface area to melt.
When it does melt, it doesn't get water all over everything.
Yep.
It stays sealed. You can huck it back in your freezer when you get home again.
Yep.
Very true.
And then that was the plan. If we would have shot something, we would have just got that out of there, got those gallon jugs because it would have needed more space, and then we just would have ran to a gas station and dumped that in there. But it would have done the job of keeping the cooler itself cold enough to the point where it's not going to spoil any meat, in any short order. So, it was a good, I guess, takeaway from that is that you can get away with some of these, more affordable coolers if you do stuff like the gallon jug trick or whatever. So, yeah.
Fantastic.
Cool, man.
What do you say we dive into last calls here real quick and then wrap this HYR September number 2 up?
Sounds good.
Put a little bow on it.
Go with your last call, Jim. I don't have one yet.
Okay, cool. I'll go first. Last call, I think Erik is an inspiring figure for anybody who wants to. This is just going to be pretty cliche to say.
Just go for it.
If you only got a weekend, Labor Day weekend, it's a 3-day weekend, and it's when some stuff starts opening up that should be pretty easily accessible. This was over the counter, essentially.
Absolutely.
You got to
totally
go out
over the counter.
South Dakota, chase some muleys, and you did it in a weekend. Went from Wisconsin.
Should have had venison at the end, too.
Should have had venison, but it's all right. That's all right.
Yep.
That was my very cliche. To the guy who told us at one point that we had our last calls are boring, that didn't help our case, but...
I'll go with this one. It ties in with yours. I may have even said it before. There's so many awesome over-the-counter options that give a person the freedom and flexibility to plan a hunt in pretty short order, and you get to go.
Yep.
And you can do it possibly, maybe it's not the most premier unit in the world, but it certainly can be if you learn it.
Yep.
Totally.
So that's my last call.
Yeah. My last call was going to be this big inspiring thing to get out there and do it because you got to try and do it at some point. But with that said about Joe earlier in the podcast, my last call is now to make sure you give whatever state it is that you're hunting, give them a shout, call them up. They will have all that information so you don't end up driving out there without a tag or something like that. They're more than happy to help you, get this stuff planned. They're just as excited to, see you come and hunt their state as you are to go out there. So give them a call and figure out what the heck to do so you don't end up in the same situation that I was.
Way to bring it home. Way to bring it home, Erik.
Yep.
Another last call is that Cooper, the dog, has been a fantastic guest on the podcast today.
Not a peep.
Not a peep. Much better than the other dog that was on that one with Josh Freilich. That was my dog, the one eating the 30 rounder. So great. Thanks everybody for listening. As always, Hunt Year Round. We'd love to hear any more suggestions that you have for some for future episodes and Hunt Year Round, things like that. And obviously now we're getting into the thick of fall. So hopefully, if you're listening to this podcast, you're on your way to go hunt something.
Absolutely.
Fantastic. All right.
Bye.
See ya.
All right, that'll wrap it up for this episode of the Vortex Nation Podcast. Thanks, everybody, for listening. Hit that subscribe button so you can always stay up to date on the latest happenings over here at the Vortex Nation Podcast. Leave us a review or comment down below. We want to hear what you have to say about the show, maybe what you like, maybe what you didn't like, so that way we can make these podcasts as good as they can be. You can also follow us on Instagram at Vortex Nation Podcast. We'll be posting about each episode released, so that way you can go back, find these things, maybe grab a little nugget of information that you could take with you to the range, out in the field, or maybe to the kitchen if we're talking about some good food. So, again, everybody, thanks, and happy hunting and shooting. We appreciate it. Have a good one.